playing the victim, and then they get stuck in this position of the victim. They get stuck in this position of blaming other people, and then they
Hey, I go by knowledge, and I've done tour the world. And the more I see, the more questions I got. But things are getting crazier. Misinformation is everywhere. So I'm on a mission to find the best minds with answers on how we fix it. It's time to drop some knowledge. Let's go.
Welcome to another episode of Dangerous Knowledge. Today, my guest, I've had this years in the making. This is Dr. Richard Blake. He's a PhD in psychology. He went to one of the top schools in California. He comes from London. But recently, he's gone viral. And the reason he's getting millions and millions of plays is he's completely flipped the script on psychology. The modern day take on psychology, which we're going to dive into, has, in my opinion, and I'm going to get opinionated on this podcast, made things worse. People are more anxious. They're more depressed. They're feeling worse than ever. Paradoxically, we have more tools. We're getting more therapy than ever. So why is that the case? I think Dr. Richard Blake has some answers. And if you see his reels on Instagram, that's what drew me in. When I first discovered you were only in a few thousand, I think, at the time. And now you're in the millions. So great to have you. It is truly a pleasure and an honor. I can't wait to dive in. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, thank you for having me, Will, on Knowledge. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. So you also do breath work. And so what made you, so you have your PhD and where you specialize in one thing, but you've gone on to really talk about breath work because that's a lot of what you talk about on social media. But what led you to these ideas in modern therapy, I guess? Because you know what? Let's start with what actually went viral. So let's talk about that, and then maybe get into what got you there.
Yeah. So I created a reel that was basically saying we have created the mental health crisis by following the wrong guy. Therapy and therapy culture is based on the works of Sigmund Freud. Pretty much everyone's heard of Sigmund Freud.
Right.
Whereas at the time, there were a lot of competing psychologists, and a better one might have been following Alfred Adler, a German psychologist. And there are a lot of other competing people. You know, some people love Wilhelm Reich, some people love Jung, which is fine. You know, this was just a 90-second reel, sort of an idea that, you know, some people have taken a bit too seriously. You know, got a lot of like emails and demands for people to take it down. But it is just a 90-second sort of, stream of consciousness that, happened to go viral. But my kind of criticism of Freud and therapy culture more broadly is that it, some people will say, Freud isn't, we don't do Freud in CBT. We don't do that much Freud in psychoanalysis, but Freud's theories are really the basis of therapy culture.
Right.
Therapy culture is this concept that came from Frank Ferrucci, a British sociologist in like the early 2000s. And it's like where therapy has bled out from the therapy room into schools, into offices, into relationships, where it shouldn't be, because therapy is supposed to be designed for mentally ill people. And when you transpose a worldview of why someone's mentally ill, often bad things have happened to them. And then you transpose that onto mentally healthy people or the worried well, they start to think, oh, the reason I'm not doing as well as someone else is not because of my failings, my shortcomings, other people's harder work. It's because something must have happened to me. Someone must have held me back. Someone must have done something to me. And that's why I'm not thriving as much as other people are. And often, certainly with Freudian stuff, we go and look at the parents. We go, well, what did your parents do or not do that led you to this attachment disorder, this wound, this trauma?
Right.
And it's not helping people, in my opinion. It's helping some people who have had legitimate traumas, but then for most people who have had like reasonable lives, they then go pointing the fingers and blaming their parents and falling out with their parents and estranging their parents and playing the victim. And then they get stuck in this position of the victim. They get stuck in this position of blaming other people, and then they never move on. Whereas Adler's take was more like, your past matters. You know, if bad things happened to you, they can, in some cases, affect your life for the rest of your life, but not necessarily, because 90% of all Encyclopedia Britannica's most notable people of all time lost one or both parents before the age of 14. You could say that's
such a paradox, right?
that, well, I mean, yeah, it in some ways. My biggest fear as a kid was, my parents dying. That would have been extremely traumatic for me. And yet all these people went on to have the most successful, most notable, beneficial effects on humanity in history. So clearly trauma is not a life sentence. For some people, it can be. For other people, it doesn't have to be. And there was another really interesting study that was on the south coast of the UK, where they looked at children who'd had really traumatic events, legitimately awful things happening. And then they followed up with them in the rest of their lives. And they found no correlation between the amount of trauma a person had and their success in, their relationships, their jobs, their health. What they found, the correlation was the people who were doing worst in their lives were the people who made the trauma and what happened to them a part of their identity. The people who were successful acknowledged it, but they didn't say, well, this is who I am. This bad thing happened to me.
Right.
And therefore, I'm never going to be able to be as successful as other people because of the things that were done to me. And Adler's take is more like what matters more for healing is community, is purpose, and it's a healthy mindset.
And I can tell you, my life experience resonates with that tremendously. You said so much in what you just said. There's so much to unpack. And I think fundamentally, what resonates with me is my own upbringing. I had a father that was very tough on me. And I think, it could be argued, again, following this formula with Freud, I could easily claim abuse. I could easily claim trauma and all these things. And several things made me question that. Exactly what you said there is studies that I've seen where paradoxically people that have been through more seem to do better. But I think even that's complex. I think fundamentally the issue to me is psychology, sociology, human interaction, the way human brain works is incredibly complex. And I think there are confounding and conflating variables. And unfortunately, with social media, there's this interaction and this belief that, because of these algorithms, they drive people to what resonates with them. It'd be very easy for me to go directly to what you're saying. There's another woman online who speaks similarly, Raquel, the Capacity. Do you know her?
Someone, just pointed her out to me. Yeah,
yeah,
a couple of videos.
And I love, and what she says really resonates with me as well. But the issue to me is that's almost a little, there's survivorship bias in that, maybe somebody's built differently. And I look to my own family for that. So, I have myself and two sisters. My younger sister's become very successful as a journalist, and my older sister's mentally ill. So, I see these variables that could potentially interact in certain ways. And I think the critical thing to recognize is that we're all different. We're all built different, just as we are health. For one person to eat nutritively one way works. And that's why some diets work on some people and others don't. So, is there something to say with how we address psychology? How do we address people with different traits? Is there a formula to understand that better for yourself as a person?
Yeah, well, like you said, it's incredibly complicated. There's so many different variables. There's genetics, there's epigenetics, there's the environment. There's so many things. From just understanding the psyche to understanding the body to spiritual things, and if you like Jung, the archetypes and what's going on in realms we don't fully understand. I think that a problem of psychotherapy is that we just put one lens onto everything. It's like at the moment it's trauma, because Gabor Mate wrote an incredibly
Yes.
successful book, great
Yes.
book. He really moved the needle on understanding trauma.
Right.
The pendulum was too far to the side of no one has trauma. Just snap out of it. And then he's now moved it to everyone has trauma, and
Right.
that's not the case, right? It's just really unhelpful to think you've had trauma when you haven't. And one of the problems with psychotherapy training is they only really talk about mental models. There is no training on the breath. There is no training on nutrition. I just read a really good book by, I've forgotten the lady's name, but all about how they're using the keto diet to treat things like schizophrenia.
I've read a book similar. I'm trying to remember the author's name, but it's a very similar book.
Yeah. So many people.
And I want to say, I agree. I can tell you, I changed my diet and it changed my life. Continue.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. And things like SSRIs as well are a big part of the problem, in that yes, they help some people, but they are often not that more successful than a placebo. For example, on the Hamilton scale, which is a rating of depression, they move depression. They help depression by 0.2, whereas exercise helps it by 0.4. And
Right.
giving someone a good night's sleep, if they're sleep deprived, moves it by 0.6.
Right.
So a good night's sleep for someone who's not sleeping well is 3 times more effective than SSRIs for antidepressants. And, medicine in general is extremely siloed. Skin doctors wear sunscreen. They don't care about your vitamin D levels and about how the mitochondria absorbs light for energy. Right. They're just like, well, as long as you've got skin cancer, then I've done my job. But they don't realize how important vitamin D is. And it's the same for all other sections of medicine. They're all only focused on their area, and it's similar for the mind. And psychotherapists, they don't really appreciate how important exercise, community, diet, fresh air, light all can be.
Right, and I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I think fundamentally the issue here, I mean, superficially, it's this. Theory in medicine, I think, that's been pervasive for the last few decades, which is, focus on some type of medication versus behavioral change. It wasn't thought to be as important. And I think fundamentally what's been happening is we've been allowing more agency to people in all kinds of ways. Choice in economics, politics, and we're essentially removing the guardrails of society as I see it. And I use my own personal experience for this. So I come from, my parents are Syrian, they're Islamic, very religious. And I have that juxtaposed to my life. And I grew up very much in rebellion to those values. And it's been to my shock as I've grown older, how much the behavioral changes that we're now suggesting are simply natural to Islamic culture. And it's finally clicked why the appeal that I've never understood. And I now see, I've read these fantastic books where they essentially dissect, the ritual aspect of religion and the therapeutic effects of that. There's a great book. I remember the author's name. He had a very Casper de Tuy, something like that. And he wrote this fantastic book on taking the benefits of religion, like, simply seeing a book as sacred, a great book, and sharing it with people, creating community. And I thought, what a wonderful idea, and now I'm fundamentally understanding even things like government. Why do we have guardrails? Why do we have these rules that seem to be so limiting? And I compare them to, say, speed limits. Why do we, you drive on a highway, and why is this limit, 70 miles an hour? I can easily drive 90. Well, the government knows, right? They know through their engineers and all these people that, hey, most people can drive 90 miles an hour. The problem with that is X, Y, Z. And the average person doesn't know these things. And I think a lot of these guardrails have developed in society over hundreds, even thousands of years. And they come off as religion and tradition, and they come off as archaic and unnecessary, and modern technology takes care of these things. But as we can see, paradoxically, it's had the opposite effect in many ways, right? There are, and let's be clear, there are, and I don't want this to be an attack on medicine, because medicine has had tremendous benefits, especially for acute ailments. I think there's no question, and I want to be clear about that. And that's where the wellness industry, I think, attacks modern medicine, and then they provide an alternative, which is oftentimes worse, right? So, and this is where it gets complex, and I think we really need to address these things. And I think fundamentally that's the issue: is we need to recognize what are guardrails we can create in society. Do you think, am I making sense with what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Have you heard of the concept of Chesterton's fence?
No.
Yeah, so G.K. Chesterton is a sort of old British philosopher, politician type person. He's like, two people go up, they're in a field and they see a fence. A liberal person sees that fence, thinks there's no reason to have it there, knocks it down. A conservative person sees that fence and goes, well, there's probably a reason that fence is there. I'm going to leave it alone. And I really like Jonathan Haidt's work.
I love that. And I do too. That's a fantastic analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
So what I think is really important about Jonathan Haidt's work, I mean, I love his book on psychology and the anxious generation, but he's also done a book on the psychology of political divides.
One of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah. And
one of my favorite books of all time. I recommend it to everybody.
Yeah, it's just really balanced in, like, we need both liberalism and conservatism. Yes. We need the conservatism to help keep our institutions intact, and we need liberalism to speak up for the oppressed, to push society further forwards. And I love that saying. Is like, you don't help the bees by destroying the hive. You need the hive to keep things together, and you need to have bees going off doing new things, trying new things, looking in new areas for pollen,
without endangering the hive in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that.
And there's another great book by Rupert Sheldrake called Science and Spiritual Practice. So he's an Oxford University.
I got to write this down.
Yeah. Science and Spiritual Practice. Rupert Sheldrake, he's an Oxford University professor. And he, looked at all religions and found sort of these 7 commonalities between them. And it was like, all religions do breath work.
No way.
When you're chanting or when you're singing hymns in Christianity, you're effectively doing breath work in time with everyone else in the room. All religions have pilgrimages, Mecca, Canterbury Cathedral, Santiago Compostela in Christianity. And they all have community. Community is such an important part. Prayer is a part of every religion, and I'm going to forget the other ones, but there are these 7 commonalities that all religions have that seem to be really good for people's well-being.
Right. And we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, essentially, when we dismiss those. And we're starting to see, in my opinion, the results of that aren't being spoken of. And I kind of want to dive into, I guess, my hypothesis through a ton of self-reflection and experience. As a creative, I feel we are both drawn to and exhibit more what would be called, I guess, the cluster B traits. When you dive into narcissism, borderline, bipolar disorders, these have become all the talk on social media now. And I think this goes back to your original post of Freud versus Adler. And I think we've really gone down a dangerous path now. And it's my contention that these are now being weaponized. These are being used against good people. I can say this from experience, as you could probably tell, where very good people are being spoken of in certain ways because we've literally made the word narcissism ubiquitous. And according to every breakup relationship, their significant other was a narcissist. So according to modern statistics, somewhere along the lines of 30% of people are people with narcissistic personality disorder. Now, that's problematic on a whole lot of levels. Number one, the definition seems to have changed from people seem to confuse narcissistic personality disorder with narcissistic traits. They have introduced a whole new set of terms, and people are being labeled as such. by these amateur psychologists, and doesn't seem to be much pushback until now with yourself and Raquel, and I'm seeing a few others now starting to push back on this. What's your take? Number one, is this happening? Number two, what do we do about it?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the sort of the medicalization of human traits. So, in the past, if you were like a loving, caring brother, sister, husband, you were just seen as like someone who like was a nice person and did things for other people. Now you're labeled as codependent, and you have to go to Codependence Anonymous for putting other people's needs first. It used to be a virtue, now it's a pathology. Similarly, when people, they want to impart their will on another person, and when that other person says no, they're labeled a narcissist, instead of just being like, well, that person has different needs and wants to me, and
Right.
instead of just accepting that that other person doesn't want the same thing as me, they're labeled as a narcissist. And similarly with this idea of boundaries is this like extremely, it seems like, inflammatory word. Young people say, oh, that's my boundary, you can't cross that. And then if someone does cross it, it's not just, well, that person has a different choice and they want something different. It's now they're an abuser. This person didn't respect my boundaries, so I have the right to cut them off.
Right.
And there was that big sort of drama with Jonah Hill, where, did you see that one? Jonah Hill, the actor. So he had a girlfriend who was like a professional surfer and a bikini model, and they broke up, and she leaked their text messages, and he was basically saying like, I don't want you to be posting photos of yourself in bikinis anymore on Instagram. That's a boundary for me. And she was like, this is what I was doing before. Like, I was a bikini model when you met me. This is my living, my livelihood.
Right.
And now you're saying this is a boundary for me.
Right.
Instead of being like, this is just what I want because I'm feeling insecure about other men looking at you, he used this psychological term to be like, well, if you do that, you are harming me in some way. You are being abusive because you're crossing my boundaries.
Right.
But all he was doing was trying to manipulate that other person to do what he wanted to do.
And so I find this, you touched on something very important here. And I think, again, this comes back to what I was saying about guardrails of society. So in defense of Jonah Hill, there's no rules anymore. And that's the deeper problem here, in my opinion. So like when people say I need a boundary or you're abusing this or that, and I agree, like that he's overstepped his limit. I mean, this is how she makes her living. So you don't date a bikini model if you're worried about guys looking at your girlfriend, right? But on that note, where is the line? Because we've removed the guardrails. There's no shame anymore in cheating. Anybody can justify it now, especially we see this in the research, the studies I've seen. When a guy cheats, he's a jerk. When a woman cheats, it's because her needs weren't being met. So, and this comes down to the deeper question to me. As a society, we label things now that we would have just applied a blanket rule and said, hey, it's all a really, really bad idea. Cheating is all kinds of bad for all kinds of reasons. And I think that's fundamentally what's creating all these problems to me, right? We know how complex human behavior is and social interactions are. And that's why we have a religion. We have societal rules that say, you know what? Cheating's a bad thing. You know what? This is bad. This is bad. Drugs, bad idea because this, and this. Alcohol, okay, we'll let a few happen. And it actually has a little bit of positive if you do it in moderation, but too much is a really bad idea. And we've now said, hey, you know what? Addiction is because of trauma, alcohol, or whatever you feel you need to do to address whatever you need. That's okay. We've removed these guardrails. At the same time, we've made people more anxious. We've made people more depressed. So we're fueling these things. And on top of this, and this is where I get hypothetical, I do think that, men, women, whomever it is, we do have certain traits, let's say borderline cluster B types or whatever it is. And I think they are amplified by stress, alcohol and drugs, and your environment. So when we create everything from social media and the way we do these things and remove the guardrails at the same time, we really are creating a dumpster fire. And then in come who are the firemen? These therapists using Freudian type psychology to say, hey, it's trauma. Hey, it's this, it's your past. And as we know, rumination is actually one of the worst things you can do. And this is where I do find CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can help, I think, because I do think a fundamental thing that I've learned about psychology, and this is, again, I want to run this by you, it's the way you talk to yourself. It's the story, the narrative you put in your mind that says, was this a trauma or was this a life lesson? And it's literally the way you spin your life, where you don't have to be in denial, but you can say, that was tough. My father was tough, but here's why. And I got this. So as hard as my father, and I want to come back to this, I hear so many people talk about their father negatively. And my father was very hard on me, but I also learned very incredible, valuable lessons. And he had a lot of very, very valuable traits in the way he was. And that's important to recognize. And that's very easy to dismiss if you believe modern psychology. I do think there's a shallowness to it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So going into the guardrails, I have got the perfect example here in that, I moved from London being like a pretty liberal guy, and coming into an extremely liberal environment and seeing what happens when you just have an echo chamber of liberalism.
Yes.
Like we said earlier, you need a balance of conservatism and liberalism, whereas San Francisco, they only have liberal politicians. And you look at the streets of San Francisco and it's the most unsafe, most awful
paradox, right?
I've ever been, because there are no guardrails. They are rewarding people for doing drugs on the street. They give them free needles.
And I'm from Vancouver, so I can relate.
Yeah.
Vancouver, Canada, it probably as bad, maybe worse.
Yeah, and they had this whole idea of like not restorative justice, but like they were saying like, the addicts are the most punished people in society. We shouldn't punish them anymore. But
right.
When you reward them by letting them have prime real estate in San Francisco and having their tents and their encampments there, and they're allowed to do drugs there, it just incentivizes them. So all the drug addicts from around around the US go to San Francisco because they're like, oh, well, the weather's nice here, prime real estate. I don't get harassed by the police. I'm just going to do more and more drugs. And then you say to them, okay, you've got a bed in this homeless shelter over here, and they don't go because they're like, well, no, I'm happy on the streets. It's much nicer just doing what I want.
Right.
And this is the problem with like, a lack of community and lack of family values is like the whole sort of one of the ideas of modern psychology is like your parents aren't that important. If your parents are being hard on you or they're imposing rules on you, they must be abusive in some way.
Right.
But actually, probably your parents want the best from you. I mean, in 99% of the cases, your parents want the best for you. They may see that in a different way, like how to do that. But when you break down the family, you see all sorts of negative things. For example, men come from single parent homes and now more likely to end up in jail than graduate from college.
Right.
Like, these things are, and a sort of offensive to some people who just think, well, single mothers are, the greatest things in history. And yes, they deserve credit for raising children on their own.
Yep. But
it would be better if they had someone and just another person there to do the job. Two people tend to do a job better than one, and then the outcomes are quite easy to see.
As a single father, I can absolutely agree with that. I am aware, and even despite breaking with my ex, I am grateful that her family's involved. Here in Las Vegas, and from the family I come from, knowing, my Syrian Islamic values are so fundamental so that despite the hardship my family has gone through, and I see, Islam is very, very strict against alcohol and drugs. And I firmly believe if that was not the case, our family would have broke down. And very much what you see in San Francisco, I see in Vancouver, where you see tremendous alcohol and drug addiction problems, and it's becoming generational. It's getting worse, and worse. And paradoxically, they're putting more money. So the drug therapy industry is very incentivized, as you talk about in one of your clips. I think your reels are fantastic, because you talk about another one where you use Princess Diana as an example. And, you introduce the concept of social contagion, which is, as soon as she talked about bulimia, all of a sudden bulimia skyrocketed, right? And I think we're seeing that with trauma. And I think we're seeing the social contagion, because I think there's another layer here. I think there's a layer of understanding the role of status and deep evolutionary drives within us. And we've essentially created a status in victimhood. Am I crazy? What do you think of this idea?
Yeah, I really like how you phrase that, status in victimhood. Yeah. I think this is, it's a real problem in the past, the people who were the most successful would get the most status, and they still do.
Right.
But, you can only have one CEO, you can only have one gold medal winner, you can only have one, Super Bowl champion or one team.
Right.
But the pyramid, gets narrower as you get to the top, because you can only have one. But at the bottom of the pyramid, there's a huge amount of real estate there for people to be at the bottom, to be the biggest victim.
Right.
And, it comes from good intentions of California giving someone a trophy for coming 25th place. Like, we don't want to hurt those people's feelings.
Right.
But actually, we're robbing them of the chance to go, oh, well, I only came 25th place. That person in first place, maybe they're, genetically better than me at this sport, or maybe they just work a lot harder than me. Maybe I need a lesson there to go, well, this was painful coming 25th. I'm going to work harder next time and improve. And just going on to the social contagion and this concept of the symptom pool. So, you mentioned the concept there, what happened with Princess Diana. She shared that she had bulimia, and cases of bulimia skyrocketed in the UK. And people will say oh, that's just because she released the stigma. It was just, people were already bulimic and they were just admitting it. And yes, that's definitely going to be a part of it. But then when Princess Diana died, cases went right back down. So clearly there was this kind of thing of Princess Diana, arguably the most beloved woman, certainly in the UK,
right,
maybe in the world at the time. Oh, well, she's getting all this attention for being a victim, and she's being called a hero for talking about her bulimia. Well, I want to be a hero as well. So maybe I could have a mental illness as well and get as much attention as her.
You got it.
And another really interesting symptom is coro. So coro is this thing that occurs it's in somewhere like a small area of Southeast Asia, where men believe that their genitals are going to go inside their body, and they develop this deathly
I've never
fear.
heard of this one.
Yeah, because it's only in this one area, right?
Fascinating.
But people in this area, one person started having coro, then other person started having coro, then another person started having coro, and then it was this mental health condition. But it didn't expand past the borders of this. I think it was an island.
Right.
And that's just a prime example of people learn from other people what mental illness they should have.
Right.
Same kind of thing happens with cutting. When cutting happens in schools, cases of cutting skyrocket. Similarly with suicide, when a suicide happens in the community, suicides go way up.
And I'm a huge believer in that as well. And as a person from British Columbia, Canada, where they really took what you see in San Francisco, I am seeing that everywhere in my hometown, which is near Vancouver. The homelessness has skyrocketed. And I think two things are happening. So, and again, it comes back to everything I've talked about removing the guardrails. So what we've essentially allowed, like in Canada, what's happened on an economic level, if you've been a property owner without any innovation, with just sitting on property, you've accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth now. And conversely, if you don't, you've become poorer and poorer. So back to, and this is where I think things have become toxic, is fewer and fewer people are getting more and more of the resources. And I think that's very dangerous for a society. And again, it comes back to guardrails. We recognize the importance of a middle class. After the Gilded Age here in the United States, right, we had these magnates, essentially hoarding the wealth, and they created laws. It started with, this has happened in America before. And Teddy Roosevelt was president at the time, and they realized we have to set up the entire population for success, because when the middle class is successful, we are all successful. And the biggest paradox of all is everybody, including the richest people, are happier when everybody's happier as a society. And this is where I think learning techniques and getting your diet and breath work are so important. So like what have you learned about breath work, and what's the value to the average person?
Yeah, so can I just comment on sort of the income inequality thing as well?
Sure.
Before,
Please do.
Yeah, I think obviously it's a huge problem, and when income inequality becomes too stark, revolutions and civil wars happen. That's often happened throughout history. So it is like a legitimate threat.
Yes.
So rich people, some rich people do recognize that threat. They've written letters to government saying, "Hey, tax us. Let's have a wealth tax. Let's disperse the wealth more and more." But I think there is some really interesting psychology about income inequality and sort of comparing yourself. They say comparison is the thief of joy.
Yes.
If you're above the poverty line, right, and let's say you're in the 30th percentile and above for wealth, you're not in not extreme poverty, or don't have too much financial insecurity. You have more power, comfort, privilege than medieval kings and queens. You have hot water, you have electricity, you have the internet, you probably afford a flight around the world, way more than a medieval king or queen could have. There's no threats of famine anymore. There's good healthcare now. We live better than those people. But if we compare ourselves to them, we'll be like, oh, brilliant. I'm richer than King Henry VIII, or, an Egyptian king, or anyone around the world. And you'd go, oh, great, I feel really good. But when we compare ourselves to the 1%, the Kardashians, the Elon Musks, and all these people,
and social media does that purposely.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes you think, oh well, these people are all mega wealthy, and I'm down here, and I can only afford a Netflix subscription and a mobile phone, and these people have jets and things like that. So I think this is where the idea of gratitude journaling can be really useful, is because if we're only ever thinking about what we lack compared to the top 1%, we're going to feel bad. But then if we're grateful for, wow, I don't have to experience famine like we would have had to done a few hundred years ago. I've got hot water like we wouldn't have had a few hundred years ago. That can be good for our mental health.
Yes.
And at the same time, that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop income inequality. That doesn't mean we shouldn't bring more people out of poverty. That doesn't mean we should continue striving. But from a mental health perspective, I think money is not as important as people make it out to be. There's so many celebrities like Will Smith. It was like, I got all this fame and fortune and I was no more happy. And you see the studies of like lottery winners and amputees. After 6 months, the amputee and the lottery winner both go back to their same level of happiness. Like being incredibly rich, like winning the lottery, doesn't make people happy. Or similarly, losing a limb, an external circumstance, we still go back to our baseline. So which speaks about how important it is to cultivate a healthy mindset, as well as striving to improve our lives financially.
I couldn't agree more. It is something I have been fascinated by, exactly what you're saying. And I've been very fortunate to have even people in my family, like, for example, my uncle is incredibly wealthy, but he's found peace in life through a variety of ways. He lives in the most expensive postal code in Canada, and yet he's very content living very modestly in other ways. I remember him owning property in one of the most expensive areas of Calgary, the city he lives in. And he literally, it was, I don't want to say a shack, but it was very, very unmatched compared to his neighbors at the time. And he just sat on it and allowed it to accumulate wealth at the time. And his sons, he had 3 sons, my cousins, and they had to share 2 bedrooms growing up. So 2 of them at a time in 1 bedroom. And it gave them incredible humility. To this day, you'd have no idea that they come from this extreme wealth. And they're also very happy people for the most part. I mean, they get through life. I always tell my uncle he should go on social media and he should show people his life. He's dived deep into diet and understanding how to live a better life himself. He's also very humble about it at the same time. But on a deeper note for myself too, I've always wanted to understand this stuff. And for me, it's understanding the brain. And, when I understood the brain and how it developed and how we've evolved, I give people the comparison. You're basically, think of yourself as a car, and you've got these different parts, and the microprocessor was built 15 years ago, but the tires were built in the 50s. The chassis was built in the 1900s, and you've got all these different parts of you, and they all communicate in various ways with each other, much like a corporation. So sometimes this department doesn't speak well to this department. So when you're going through confusing feelings, there's a reason for that. It's because your brain has evolved to basically prepare itself for a multitude of scenarios. So it could be an incredibly stressful environment. It could be a peaceful environment, and your brain doesn't know. And it gets some clues through things like epigenetics. So what your grandparents even went through and what your parents went through, and that can model your behavior. And that's actually my take on why there are some personality disorders. This is a crazy theory of mine, by the way, that I wanted to bring up to get your food for thought on. This possibility that maybe things that our parents and grandparents, in the same way, are you familiar with like how allergies are epigenetic?
Yep.
So allergies essentially come from, so like my parents are from Syria. They were born in a, very sterilized environment. I was born in a sterilized environment in Canada, and I have allergies, which are essentially an overreaction of my immunization, of my immune system. What if that's personalities? What if that's what people go through? Maybe that's what's happening with personality disorders. What if, grandparents or parents grew up in a very stressful environment, and then their kids grew up in this healthy environment, and their brains are almost an overreaction. This is a crazy idea that I think may be worth exploring because of my experience and what I've seen in people who have mental health conditions. And I think culturalization, there's all kinds of conflating and confounding variables. And that's what makes this so complex.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to Jonathan Haidt, he talks about, safetyism, the culture of safety in young generations. They've just been told, safety is the most important thing. Yeah.
Right.
You sanitized your house. Whereas, they find that people who have raised around farm animals have much fewer allergies. People who have dogs have fewer allergies because the dogs bring in dirt and things like that.
Yes.
People who have dishwashers have more allergies than people who don't have dishwashers because the dishwashers do such a good job of cleaning the dishes that no one's ever exposed to any bacteria, so they don't develop that healthy immune system. And Jonathan Haidt's talk about microaggressions. There was this sort of, probably good idea to be like, we've got to get rid of microaggressions and, racism and subtle misogyny and things like that. But when people walk around thinking, oh, is that a microaggression? Someone may be microaggressive to me. They're in this constant state of heightened alert, constant state of fear. And then they're just more anxious because they think, oh, a microaggression is going to harm me and that's going to spike my cortisol. And that's akin to violence. So people are, the concept creep of violence has expanded so much now that someone can be violent to you by accidentally saying something that is a racial stereotype when they maybe they don't know any better.
For sure I see that all the time myself, and this is where it comes back to what we're saying, and I want to know so how does breath work fit into all this?
So breathwork is a pretty broad term. I do a few different types. So there's Wim Hof is probably the most famous one at the moment. So that's kind of intermittent hypoxia, comes from Tumo in Southeast Asia. I teach something called Soma breathwork, which is a similar type of thing with intermittent hypoxia. There's also functional breathing. So the Oxygen Advantage, I'm certified in that. And that's about helping people to breathe, more efficiently. So there's a statistic like 80% of people with anxiety have dysfunctional breathing. So just breathing in a more functional way can alleviate people's anxiety. And then what I'm most interested in is this type of breathing called conscious connected breathing. And that's what I did my PhD study on. I ran the largest randomized control trial on conscious connected breath work.
No way.
And this is it's akin to a psychedelic. this type of breath work. So it
Okay.
can put you into an altered state. So it's not something you just do randomly. Like I can't talk you through it on a podcast. We need like a 20-minute setup. You need to be in like a safe space. You need to be lying down. You need to be, free from disturbances. And I teach this technique, and it's a kind of voluntary over breathing. And with this over breathing, you're changing your blood chemistry, you're changing the alkalinity of your blood, and going into this altered state akin to a psychedelic. And now I don't have to just say like, oh, it's like a psychedelic, because they've done studies now where Alessandro Colasanti, a researcher in the UK, put people in an MRI machine that had them do this breath work, and their brain, their cerebral hemodynamics, which is the blood flow in the brain, changed to the same extent as a 3-gram dose of psilocybin mushrooms.
No way.
Which is a moderate dose, a small to moderate dose.
Incredible.
Similarly, they've done something with EEG, so that's measuring brain waves, and again, they found changes in brain waves akin to a moderate dose of psilocybin mushrooms.
Incredible.
And I think this. So my study.
This is revolutionary. I think
so.
I would love to spread this with you.
Yeah,
I want to dive into this, but yeah. I don't want to. Maybe that's sorry. Continue.
Yeah. So, there's quite a few studies coming out on it now. There weren't much when I started my PhD sort of 5 or 6 years ago. But we ran a study on anxiety. So people with clinically high levels of anxiety, they did 6 sessions of conscious connected breath work as a part of a group online. So doing it over Zoom, we had about 25 people at a time doing it with me and other facilitators supporting. We measured their anxiety at the start. The average anxiety at the start was 45 on this scale of 80. So we use the Zung self-rating anxiety scale. That's a moderate diagnosis of anxiety. And we had a control group of people. We just told them, you'll just be on a wait list. You'll do treatment as usual. The waitlist group over 6 weeks, their anxiety went down 1 point or 1.8 on this 80-point scale, whereas the breathwork group went down about 11 points.
Oh my God!
So it's like 1,000% more effective than the control. And
incredible.
The average was 45. It went down to 34, which is a remission of anxiety.
Incredible work. And you touched on something earlier on in our conversation, and I want to add to that. So when, you talk about breath work and the chanting and all this, so this comes back to my favorite topic, music, right? I think there's tremendous therapy in music. I think my hunch tells me there's so much work that can be done by music with what you're doing with breath work. I think there's a connection with social chanting. I know there are studies that show that humming at certain frequencies produces nitric oxide within us, which of course has a tremendous amount of health benefits. And then I would like to tell you that I have been using a device which had its sort of, it was very popular. It had like this cult-like following, I want to say like 10 years ago. And I truly believe it is the most effective external device I have ever used. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's TDCS. Are you familiar with TDCS?
Transcranial direct current stimulation, yes.
Correct. I have a hunch that when you combine that with what you're doing, there could be tremendous, incredible benefits.
Yeah.
So have you tried TDCS yourself?
Yeah, I used something, I think it was called the Halo. It was designed for like lifting weights.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know the one.
I have really thick hair, so I could never get it to connect.
I'm bald. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's that issue. I've seen that with people, and I'm bald, so it works like gangbusters for me. But I have found montages that are incredible. And the one that I use has quite big sponge pads. So maybe someone with you, like with thick hair, it could be effective. I found a particular montage that I think is incredibly effective. And I also believe in isochronic tones. Are you familiar with isochronic tones?
Yeah.
And certain diet supplementation as well. I believe number one with diet is taking things out. That's where it starts. With me, with people, like type 2 diabetes is rampant. It runs in my genes. And I think people, and this is my suspicion, people with type 2 diabetes or are prone to it are more likely to have mental health issues by poor diet. That's, again, it's my hypothesis. And so I would say for anybody with mental health conditions, that's where I would start. I don't know. Please stop me. You're the guy with the PhD, so I don't like to say things that go beyond my scope of expertise.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think there's sort of there's several parts to that with diabetes. Like sometimes the diabetes is causing the mental health issues, and sometimes the diabetes is there to manage the mental health issues. Like
Oh,
I like
really?
what Yeah, I mean, compulsive overeating is not in itself a problem. Normally, it's someone has an issue, a mental health issue, they're anxious, so they eat to manage their
Right.
emotions. So it can be both ways. There was like a study on some obese people, and these people lost the weight, but then they put the weight right back on, and then they interviewed these people, and I think, well, they interviewed the women. Well, they interviewed everyone, but the women specifically said, when I lost the weight, I realized I became attractive, and people were giving me attention, and I was getting sexual attention from other
And
people.
that was,
And I was sexually abused as a younger person. So I put on the weight as a protective layer
oh
so
my
that I
God,
no longer got the sexual attention, because that didn't feel safe
fascinating.
to me.
And this goes right back to what I was saying about guardrails in society. Like, I truly do try to empathize with women. I do believe these guardrails. I don't believe in the extreme, hijab and all that with Islam, but I do agree that women are entitled to a certain level of expectation from men. That a society should expect men to behave with women. And when, again, we remove the guardrails, it's a free for all. And we have all these, who knows how rampant stuff like this is. And it's what you could call it, in baseball, an unforced error. Like it's something that is entirely unnecessary that we don't see until we remove the fence. I'm going to, by the way, steal that analogy you made. And I think that there are solutions. And I think it's by having these conversations and making people aware of brilliant work like yourself. I would love to dive in. Before you go, I would love to talk about, I loved your reel about the human soul. So to me, that you really are quite a holistic thinker. So tell us about what you've seen about studies that show the potential for a human soul.
Mm. Yeah, so a study came out recently that found that when people die, their brain releases like a pulse of gamma synchrony. So it's a type of brainwave that's associated with mystical experiences. And yeah, some people are suggesting this could be evidence of the soul leaving the body, because it's this like big spike of energy. And similarly, I wrote a lot in my PhD dissertation about near-death experiences and how therapeutic they are. So
Right,
people have
right.
had near-death experiences. Like often they're looking at people who had suicide, who are attempting suicide, and they didn't succeed. They came back, and their mental illness was gone because they had a mystical experience. They're like, oh, I met God, and they said it wasn't my time. I met my grandfather, and he said, you're loved, and everything's going to be okay, and we're looking after you. And yeah, these mystical experiences have huge impact on our mental health outcomes. So yeah, with NDEs, near-death experiences, that's one way that people get these positive outcomes. But also with psychedelic research, they found that the greater the intensity of someone's mystical experience, the greater their improvements in mental health outcomes afterwards. And same with breath work. So a lady called Martha Havenith, a German researcher, did this really clever study where she measured people's the depth of their altered state during conscious connected breathwork by checking in every 15 minutes. They would go up to the participants who are breathing and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how altered are you? 1, not that altered; 5, extremely altered. And some people, they were so altered they couldn't even raise their hands. And then they followed up afterwards with, they did a before and after study of their, I think it was the state trait anxiety scale, and they looked at sort of all measures of people's mental health. And they found that the deeper people went into their mystical experience, the greater the improvements they had in their mental health afterwards.
Fascinating. Man, all of this, to me, there's a way to connect your breath work with this mysticism, with music. And I think that many of these things are being manipulated by all the wrong people in society. And I think there's something here. Ironically, there's a girl that I follow. I want to say her name is Emma. She just wrote a book, and she's in London as well. She's in London. I love what she talks about music. It's very inspiring. She talks about dancing, and we do know the correlation between physical movement and mental health as well. I think there's something here more beyond what we're talking about. I think there's a movement here to truly create a holistic mental health experience for community. And I don't even want to use the word mental health. I just want to call it community and thriving. We have an abundance of wealth as a society on a global scale. There are ways to truly transform people, I think. And we really touched on a few of them here in this conversation, man. What a difference an hour can make, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've so enjoyed this conversation. So where can people find you on social media? Where can people see your work? Because you have your own podcast, right?
That's right. Yeah, I have a podcast with my co-host Joseph. We have a company called Runga. The podcast is called Runga Radio, Runga, and we do retreats. We are about to launch our 90-day intensive, which is sort of really taking people through the basics of how to improve their life, how to be happier. It includes several sessions of online conscious connected breath work, as well as all functional breathing and the intermittent hypoxia, as well as going over diet and exercise and community and meaning and journaling. And
I love it.
Yeah, so you can find that, runga.co/intensive. Hoping to launch that next week, but if you get there before that, it's you can join the wait list and get a good deal on that program.
Awesome.
And then I'm at the Breath Geek on Instagram.
Yes.
I think I'm on TikTok. I don't use it much, but I'm Dr. Breath Geek on TikTok.
So I would love for this conversation to continue, man. I really hope I'm happy to send you the TDCS device that I use and to show you the montage that I think induces incredible happiness to the point of psychedelics as well. As a person that's tried psychedelics, I have very little addiction. And I'm diving in a little bit on my personal side. I was introduced to this by a previous relationship. And so I have tried MDMA, and I can say this is the closest experience I've had to MDMA. And it's, I think, far more healthy for most people. And when combined with your breath work and music, I think we can introduce something incredibly healthy for society.
Absolutely.
So let's keep the conversation going, man. Thank you so much for being on here. And let's do this again. I want to dive deeper into some of your work because I think it's so interesting.